This is something I've talked about a good bit. By way of introduction, I'm a historian. I spent my first 6 years of graduate school doing Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern languages. My PhD, which I am just about finished, is in American religious history and history of Christianity with a background in history of science. I focus particularly on creation and evolution conflict in the book of Genesis, both in the ancient and the modern world. And so, as part of my pastoral interests, there are a lot of academics who just talk to academics, and I am interested in my academic topics to enhance the community, to help people, to answer questions. I spend a lot of time with missionaries, fielding questions from them. I spend a lot of time writing for the average Latter-day Saint. I have a blog at spackman.com. I have podcasts and YouTube videos and interviews with people. And so tonight what I hope to do is enhance your scripture study by showing you a little bit how to read like a scholar and what that can get you. Neil Maxwell called that disciple scholarship. He had a whole little book on it. Now I do want to make clear up front something that I want to make sure people don't take away from this. God does not expect everyone to learn Hebrew. You do not need a degree to give a good lesson or a talk. Those things are not necessary for discipleship. They can enhance it, but if you come away from this going, God's not pleased with me unless I've got at least a master's degree in Greek and can read the New Testament in the original, that's the wrong takeaway. But that is my background. So, for most of us, when we pick up scripture to read, to study, we have a couple of goals that are personal, that are spiritual. I think most of us, when we open our scriptures, we want to have an experience with God. We want to feel the divine. We want to feel close. We want to feel the Spirit. That is what we're looking for. And that may lead us to turn more to, say, the Gospels or the Book of Mormon as opposed to, say, Leviticus or Paul's letters, something a little weirder, a little more complex. We turn to Scripture looking for personal revelation, looking for answers to questions, not necessarily about, Paul's Greco-Roman background, but say, should I take this job? Should I marry that person? How should I treat this issue with my kid? This is serious, and I don't know what to do with it. And at least from missionary stage onwards, we are looking to increase in Christ-like attributes and understanding. We're trying to become more like Jesus. If there is no higher goal of discipleship than to become as he is. Now, on the other hand, and I think you all have a pretty good grasp on that. That's not what I'm here to talk about this evening. I'm here to share the other part. If you are a scholar or an academic, you are likely to come from any number of backgrounds. In my graduate classes, we had Christians of various stripes. We had lapsed Christians, we had Jews, we had Muslims, we had atheists. And as we are all reading sections of Job in Hebrew together, what we had to come to agree on was not things based on our personal religious convictions. It had to be based in the text. We wanted to understand the text literally and contextually, not looking for personal application, not looking for what my church says this passage means. We're trying to get at what it meant to the original author, the first audience. How did they understand this? And the tools scholars use to get at that are not dependent on the assumptions that you bring as a believer of a various kind or a non-believer. There are Jewish New Testament scholars. There are Mormon scholars of Islam. There are atheist scholars of the New Testament. Because personal belief is not necessary for studying as a scholar. That's not how the methods work. We bracket those assumptions. I didn't realize I'd be blocking part of my own slides here. That's a little awkward, but that's okay. Now, you'll note that I said, understand the text literally. This is a phrase that sometimes gets thrown around without a lot of definition. What does it mean to read literally? And a similar question, What does reading literally get us? And how do we do it? I'm going to give you a couple examples this evening after demonstrating that it's something that we should be doing as Latter-day Saints. A couple of years ago, as Come Follow Me was just coming out, a BYU professor named Gay Strathairn, who actually studied at my alma mater at Claremont, got interviewed in the church news. And she talked about two ways of reading Scripture, that we should be doing both of them. They coexist. Noting the importance of understanding the context in which the Scriptures were written and the intentions behind what was included by their authors, Strathairn explained that a twofold interpretation is necessary to increase spiritual and practical understanding of the Scriptures and their doctrines. Readers need to understand how to interpret the text according to the text itself, including the authors who wrote it, as well as how to interpret the text in a way that is personal and applies to them currently as individuals and families. So what she's setting out here is there is original, literal, contextual meaning, and there is what we take away from it that applies to us, that helps us with our kid, that helps us with that job, that changes our life and makes us better disciples. Those two things coexist. They overlap. They don't push each other out. But what it means is a literal reading is not a face value reading. It's not a reading that assumes that the text you're looking at is a straight history. A literal reading is a contextual reading, trying to understand the passage as the author wrote it, as the primary audience understood it, with as much information from the past as possible. Now, another little side note here. I sometimes get questions about this point about, well, what's the role of the Spirit in this? And I tend to go to Joseph Smith as an example. I do not spend a lot of time exhorting people to seek the Spirit because we're supposed to be doing that anyway, and you hear it in so many other talks anyway. And I am in no position to be telling you all how to feel and seek the Spirit more. That's not my core competency. We are to seek the Spirit, but the Spirit will not do work for us. When Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, he had to rely on the Spirit because nobody knew the language of the Book of Mormon. Nobody could do it. On the other hand, when Joseph Smith wanted to learn Hebrew, what did he do? The Spirit did not download it into his head. He hired a tutor. He had to import him into Nauvoo. He had to buy a lesson book. He had to buy a dictionary. Then he had to do exercises and study. The Spirit helped him, but it didn't do it for him. The Spirit will generally not reveal things to us that are available through human means. It is not an instant shortcut to everything. So seek the Spirit, but realize that the Spirit is not like a tool you take off the shelf and put it back on. As we move into reading Scriptures literally, there are two phrases I want you to keep in mind because they encompass so much about what is good and useful about this. And they are useful to think of when you're studying your own Scriptures. These two phrases are that first, Scripture is for us but not to us. I'm going to explain both of these. And it goes without being said. Now, both of these phrases come from biblical scholars who have written popular books, and I can refer you to them if you want. This first phrase, that Scripture is for us but not to us, we today here are not the primary audience of Scripture. Now, we had dinner with a convert once, and I said this to him, and he said, "Wait, what?" And I said, "No, none of our Scriptures, Latter-day Saints or not, were written for people in America in 2020. We are not the primary audience. We're a secondary audience." And he said, "I'd never thought of that." Well, in general conference, the prophets address us here today. And so it follows that past prophets have spoken to the people in their own time and place. And so when we read past prophets, it's essentially like we're reading general conference reports from, 1600 BC. They are not speaking to us directly. They're talking to their own people, addressing their own problems, and so on. Paraphrasing President John Taylor, the Bible was written for the people of its day. Isaiah, Ezekiel, etc. had revelations for themselves, not us. And this can take us by surprise. Partly, I think, because of how Scripture comes to us. You know, we have our quad, it's leather bound, it's got my name on it, it's all neatly indexed, and it seems almost like an encyclopedia, right? God's encyclopedia that we have right there and we just flip through. But Scripture is kind of an artifact of history. We are looking backwards in time when we are opening our quad. Well, if prophets in the past spoke primarily to their own people in their own time and context and addressing their problems, what are the implications of that? There's this principle of accommodation. And I've been preaching this for years, so it was nice to see it show up in the Leona by Elder Holtzoffel, whom I actually know a bit. God speaks in the cultural context of the life and time of a person or people. He communicates according to their understanding. The Lord kindly condescends to communicate his will in their language and culture so he can instruct and succor them. We find this in D&C and in Nephi. We also find this in the Bible and all over the place in Christian and Jewish history. Holtzoffel continues, when a culture dramatically changes over time, and note that our culture today is radically different than New Testament culture or Old Testament cultures or Book of Mormon culture, and even the culture of the Doctrine and Covenants. We should not be surprised that the Lord reveals his mind in a new cultural context based on the time, place, and understanding of the people. So, if Scripture is for us, that is, God intends us to read it and profit from it, but we're not the primary audience, it implies something else. That is, it goes without being said. And here I have what I hope are some fun examples. Captain America may have beat the Nazis in World War II, but he's no Captain Moroni. I borrowed this from a friend, his article about to be published in January. Think about this statement. What do you have to know to grasp the point of this statement, right? You have to have some Latter-day Saint inside knowledge of who Captain Moroni is and how he functions in the Book of Mormon and in Latter-day Saint culture. You have to know some 20th century international history. You also have to know some pop culture, Captain America. You also should probably know that Captain America is fictional and Captain Moroni is not. This would make sense to any Latter-day Saint because of a shared frame of cultural references. If you went back to Joseph Smith, you would say, okay, Moroni I know, but none of the rest of this makes sense to me. The things that make sense of this can all go without being said because we all share them. Second example, the Cowboys defeated the Giants in the fourth. What do you have to know to make sense of this? Obviously, Cowboys are a real thing, but I thought Giants were mythological, and fourth what? Fourth age? Fourth era? What's a down? Cowboys and Giants exist in various ways and forms. We don't communicate these things explicitly, we understand them. And if you've ever not been a sports ball person and accidentally been exposed to some sports ball language, you end up with something like this. Rashid scored a crucial 23 ball, 22 coming lower down the order to arrest a slide as Afghanistan recorded 284 in 49.5 overs. He then followed up with a 3-wicket haul. Mujibur Rahman first slammed a 16-ball 28 before picking 3 for 51 off his 10 overs to take home the Player of the Match trophy. Now, at this point, we might go, okay, Player of the Match is a good thing, so all this stuff coming before seems like it's good. Quote, as a spinner, it's very hard to bowl in the power play. Oh, yeah, well, obviously, right? That's what spinners say. Does anyone understand what's going on here? Is anyone a cricket fan? Okay, there's one who might understand this. This is insider knowledge. Sports reports presume that you all understand the conventions of the game, the rules, the form of reporting, right? They don't explain it to you because they assume you understand it. It goes without being said. And prophets speaking to their contemporaries often could leave so much that went without being said. We oftentimes read our Bible as though its peoples were American and interpret in terms of our own background in psychology. But the Bible is actually a Near Eastern book. It was written centuries ago by Near Eastern people and primarily for Near Eastern people. That's Sidney Sperry, one of our first Latter-day Saint Bible scholars, writing in the Ensign. At times when we pick up Scripture, There are passages that are called high context, where we know we have no clue what's going on, like the cricket report. Isaiah is like that. Isaiah just throws out rapid fire people, places, events, not quite dates, but rituals. And he just expects that everyone can follow that because his original audience could. When we pick that up, it's like we're reading the cricket report. We know something's going on. We have a sense that it's important. Seems good, but maybe bad. Can't quite tell. However, this is always going on. At other places in ancient scripture, the same thing is happening. There just aren't those signs that say something's going on that you don't understand. This is the principle of it goes without being said. So if we have these two summary principles, that Scripture is for us but not to us, and that so many things could go without being said, that it implies that we cannot learn fully from Scripture as disciples unless we are also trying to learn about Scripture through scholarship, through trying to recover all of those things that went without being said, that we have to get through history and linguistics and cultural studies and other things. Now, funny enough, the impulse to study history and languages and cultures is something we're all supposed to do. Study and learn and become acquainted with all good books and with languages, tongues, and people. D&C 90, verse 15. Obtain a knowledge of history and of countries and of kingdoms and of laws of God and man, and all this for the salvation of Zion. D&C 93. The Come Follow Me Old Testament manual gestures in this direction. You can find meaningful insights about a scripture if you consider its context, the circumstances, or setting. And knowing what kind of book you are studying can help you understand how to study it. Now, this second phrase, knowing what kind of book something is a really light gesture towards something that we are all very familiar with and throw out completely when it comes to studying Scripture. That is, when you go into the library or when you open up Netflix, you are confronted with a series of categories. You do not open up Netflix and go, do I want to watch something literal or figurative? You have choices between historical and non-historical. You have things that blend those, like historical fiction that might have real people and places, but non-historical stories. You might get genres mashed together, like the movie called Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, which is historical fiction, horror, fantasy, right? That's an actual movie. For people who like Jane Austen, there is Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, which is a Victorian romance with zombie horror in it, right? These are different genres that have been mixed together. And when we open Scripture, what we are encountering is a library of different kinds of things that have all been placed next to each other. We have narrative, biography, and letters. We have poetry and prose. We have legal texts, songs, ritual instructions. We have nonfiction, historical fiction, and fiction. Now, if that strikes you as weird phrasing, I'm thinking particularly about the genre that we probably recognize the easiest, namely parables. The purpose of a parable is not to recount historical events. It's to make a moral point and make people think about it, right? There is an evangelical scholar named Kenton Sparks, whose books I really like, and he made this point very nicely. He said, Jesus' preferred method of teaching truth was fiction. Now let's, one more. The church actually has a study book, Scripture Study, The Power of the Word. Lesson 11 talks about bridging the cultural gap. This is just rehashing more of the same stuff. So if we want to read literally, we have to study some of this stuff. And if you just open your King James Version, it's not really there. What you have is the text, occasionally with translation footnotes at the bottom. There's the Bible dictionary at the back that's helpful, but it's somewhat outdated. We didn't write that from scratch. It was based on a Cambridge Bible dictionary from 1902. What does literal reading get us? First of all, it makes Scripture less weird, more accessible, more interesting, more rewarding. I have been recommending modern translations of the Bible and study aids like I'm going to get into for 20 years. And with rare exception, everyone who picks one up comes back to me and says, this is really interesting. I am actually really liking this. By the way, have you looked at this passage that says this with the footnotes talking? And I go, I hadn't noticed that one. That is interesting. How many times last year in Old Testament did you read through something and go, I think I know what's going on and I have no idea why and I don't want to apply it to myself or my family? Reading literally can dispel conflict. This is something I get to do with missionaries a lot where they have a particular question. And I say, well, here's some background knowledge that makes sense of this. There's actually not a contradiction here, or there's actually something else going on that's not apparent. And sometimes this is very simple, sometimes it's fairly complex. But as we dispel conflict, we also build faith and testimony. We realize that Scripture is not as foreign or as bizarre or as different as we thought. And that's important. I have known people who have lost faith because of things they found in Scripture that weren't really there, because they didn't understand it well. They weren't able to get below the surface, and it kind of gnawed at them. And lastly, I think better personal application. I think the more we understand the Scriptures, the better able we are to actually apply them to our lives and change. We better understand how God has acted in the past. We better understand what He is asking of us to do. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. First, Genesis and science. Then we're going to talk briefly about prophets and poetry. Then grace, faith, and works. And then since we're hitting Book of Mormon next year, I have 1 example, maybe 2, time dependent. Genesis and science is something I have been working on for 20 years. And I have a massive string of notes here. And I decided to be wise and not try to get into it. Suffice to say, the conflict that many people have seen between science and religion, or between Genesis and evolution, or between the age of the earth and what science says, 95% of that stuff disappears when you read Genesis contextually, literally, as the Israelites understood it. This is something that I went through as an undergraduate and then a graduate. But this stuff is fascinating, and I can recommend bales of interesting books or podcasts to you about this stuff. Read literally, as Israelites understood it, Genesis has very little to do with modern controversies like the age of the earth or evolution. Israelites were concerned about very, very different things. This is not a rhetorical question. Are any of you struggling with polytheism? It's okay, you can be honest. One of the biggest theological questions for the Israelites was, what god or gods are really in charge of the universe? What's the place of humans in it? And I did an archaeological dig in Israel for a month as part of my second round of grad school. And one of the things that you find in very obviously Israelite places is little idols. Israelites and their neighbors did not conceive of the universe as a machine governed by rules. They thought of it as a kingdom, or maybe more accessible, a corporation. God was the CEO. He had people assigned to different areas to make sure things ran well. If you ever go to Egypt and see the temples, or Babylon, this is clearer, but basically every part of existence was managed by a different deity or sub-deity. There was a god of war, there was a god of love, there was a god of crops and rain. And the Israelites simply couldn't believe that only one God was in charge of all this stuff. Imagine that you move into a new condo and you meet the landlord and you say, who do I talk to about garbage? And he says, oh, I do that. Oh, well, that's kind of weird. Who do I hook up my electricity with? I do the electricity as well. Recycling? That's me. Internet? Yeah. Water connection? I also do the water connection. I'm also your insurance guy, and I handle your loan. We would think that was really bizarre. Well, that's basically the Israelites' world, right? Life was short and hard, and if your wife was pregnant and your crops were failing, are you really just going to put all your hopes on one single deity? maybe you were going to sneak off and sacrifice something to, the deity to help make your wife better. The big question for the Israelites was polytheism. And that's not even on our top 20 list today. And so we tend to read Genesis 1 and be like, oh, science and the days and Darwin. And that's not what was at play for the Israelites. Genesis 1 has some very, very clear things, if you are reading through Israelite glasses, that shoot down polytheism left and right. Very quick one. If you read through it in English or in Hebrew, you will note that it never says sun or moon. It says greater light and lesser light. It's very obvious what these are referring to. Why doesn't it use the terms? Ancient languages, at least the ones I know, they do not have capitals. And there was no moon with a small m, but moon with a large M might be the moon god, right? To say the name of the sun was to invoke the sun god. Sun and moon were deities just about everywhere outside of Israel, and sometimes in Israel too. So in Genesis 1, has God create the greater light and the lesser light? First, it's saying, these things are subordinate to the God of Israel. And second, these things are such non-deities, we don't even use their names. That's how non-important they are in the cosmos. Israelites understood this. We don't, unless we're reading through Israelite lenses. So, Genesis and science. Second one, prophets and poetry. Now this may seem weird, unless you were an English major. Most people are not much into poetry these days. I have a brother who is fluent in Arabic and lives in Saudi Arabia, and there you can still make a living as a poet. It's very popular. There are poetry recitals attended by thousands of people. Arabic is a Semitic language. It's related to Hebrew. Their poetry works differently than ours. It does not rhyme. Rather, it works by repetition of various kinds. Virtually all ancient prophetic texts are poetry. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, the entirety of Psalms, 2 Nephi 4, a couple other places. Back when the Ensign was running competitions, there was a winning article explaining Old Testament poetry. It goes in depth. It gives examples. It uses some technical terminology. This is June 1990, if you want to get into it. But the key is repetition. You would say something, then you would say it again a slightly different way. It might be, listen to your mother's words, do not ignore your father's counsel. You can see a variation of A. So here's an example from Isaiah 5:7. God looked for justice, but behold oppression. For righteousness, but behold a scream. Now, if we're going to put this into parallel lines, you can see that repetition, that parallelism a little bit. This first verb, God looked for, is implied in the parallel part. You can see how justice has its opposite oppression and righteousness has its opposite a scream. God was looking for one thing, and the Israelites produced the exact opposite. Now, modern translations of the Bible will do this. They will set off poetry visually by lining up the parallels for you. This is Genesis 49, and you can see in verse 2, all of a sudden it's shifted into parallel lines and poetry. This is Jacob talking to his 12 sons. This is the first patriarchal blessing, so to speak, and it's poetry as prophetic texts are. And this is out of the Jewish Study Bible. I actually brought a couple things for show and tell later. You can come up and look at them. So let me go back to Isaiah and poetry. In order to express what he saw as the ghastly perversion of values in society, Isaiah frequently juxtaposed two words that sounded almost alike but were opposite in meaning, with the intention of showing linguistically how his Israelite contemporaries had turned moral values topsy-turvy, substituting evil for good, vice for virtue. And so here are the parallel lines, but with Hebrew, and I'm going to substitute that for you. God looked for mishpat, but behold mishpach. God looked for tzedakah, but behold tzedakah. To an Israelite, this would hit hard. Without the wordplay, one misses the point of these prophecies. Now, I think Alter might be overstating it a little there. But it certainly would have more impact in Hebrew than it does in translation. especially if you're not aware of the nature of poetry. And so what Alter has done is he has provided an entire translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, by himself, with literary commentary, trying to point out all of these puns, all of these literary references, all of the things that are being done in the original that simply can't survive into translation. And I will say, having done a lot of Hebrew, a lot of times, unless you're native, and nobody is anymore, these can go over your head. What we all need is someone who spent 60 years doing this, as Alter did, spelling it out for you. And I have his 3-volume thing up here. So let's move into example number 3. Latter-day Saints, especially missionaries, tend to have a lot of conversations with evangelicals and Protestants over grace and works. They tend to throw certain passages at us, and we don't really deal with those passages. We just fire back other passages, and we just go in a circle. This is not very productive. It's also a bit of a misunderstanding. Obviously, we have a lot more texts from the New Testament time than just the New Testament. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of documents in Greek and Latin. And from these documents, we now understand that there was a cultural social system of patronage. There wasn't really any middle class at all. It was basically about 95% peasants, about 4% kind of mid-level artisans, people who worked for the government, and the 1%. And so if you were in that 95%, and you had a problem you could not solve, you needed to borrow money, you needed a doctor, you needed a connection to a faraway place, you had a problem you couldn't solve. What you would do is you would go to one of these rich, connected, powerful people, and you would propose a relationship. This is called the patron-client relationship. And essentially, in this relationship, which was entirely unequal, the patron would say, I will take care of your problem. And obviously, you can never pay me back, but what you owe me in return in this relationship is, I want you to tell people about me, talk about my goodness. And if I do ask you to do something, you're a little bit in my debt. There is kind of an allegiance here. It's obviously not a quid pro quo because it can't be, but this is the nature of our relationship. We're friends. I have helped you. I want you to help me as you can within your own sphere. What the patron did for the client was called charis. And what the client owed the patron was called pistis. That's the noun. The verb was pisteuo. Now here's where the rubber hits the road. When these words appear in the New Testament, the way they are translated is grace and faith, or believe. Now, the verbal form of pistis, pisteuo, to be clear, it does sometimes mean what we think of when we say faith or belief. It's mental assent to something. It's mental agreement to a particular doctrine or idea, right? But as in this relationship, it carried heavy, heavy overtones of loyalty, allegiance, faithfulness, fidelity. It was not a mental word alone. And when we bring this into certain New Testament passages, like this one, which tends to be one thrown at missionaries, for by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. So all you have to do is believe, and God saves you, through grace, end of story. That's the modern distortion of Martin Luther, right? If we approach this thinking that faith is simply a mental thing, an assent, an idea, then yeah, missionaries are just going to fire back James, right? No, faith without works is dead. But that doesn't help us with understanding. So let's substitute back in. For by charis are ye saved through pistis, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. By the goodwill of the patron are ye saved through allegiance, through loyalty, through fidelity. We're in this relationship, and I do this for you. And that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, who is the patron in this metaphor. So he doesn't owe us. He doesn't have to do it for us. But it is because he is so good, it is because he loves us that he is willing to enter into that very, very unequal relationship and do this for us. And what do we offer in return? We offer our pistis. We offer our loyalty. We offer our allegiance. We offer enacted obedience. A number of scholars today are translating Christ as king. And if we bring that back into the New Testament, to proclaim Jesus is king entails that if we are one of his servants, we do what the king says. We owe the king our allegiance as one of his subjects. Now, the king subject might be a little more familiar to us than the patron-client relationship, but Paul did not invent these terms. He is very much using them, pulling out of the Greco-Roman model. And this gets us out of the idea that so many evangelicals seem to have, that faith is simply a mental thing. If you're doing any works, then you're trying to save yourself, and that's not what Paul taught. Well, it turns out that's not what Paul taught. Paul taught that if you enter into this relationship, you owe your loyalty, you owe your allegiance, and so you do what Jesus asks you to do as your patron, as your king. Now, since we are getting into Book of Mormon, let me do one of these from the Book of Mormon. Get a lot of questions from missionaries because they see Jesus called the Father in the Book of Mormon. And what they bring to this is discussion with other Christians who are coming at it from a classical Trinitarian perspective. They say, why is Jesus the Father? This is really weird. I don't get it. And stepping back a little, what they're doing is they are reading ancient scripture through some modern lenses. And here, let me tell you a little story because I think it's kind of fun. And it tells you how I got to this. When I first started studying Hebrew, I learned that all Hebrew names have meaning. Maybe if you've seen the movie from the late 80s, early 90s, Dances with Wolves, this was kind of a thing in Native American languages too. Dances with wolves, stands with your fist. That's not quite how it works in Hebrew. They're all names involving the name of God. God does something, right? And I came across a name that meant God is my Father. I said, well, straight truth, pure doctrine, makes good sense. Then I came across a couple of Hebrew names that were variants of God is my brother. And I thought, well, Jesus is our elder brother, I guess, but did the Israelites know that? That's a little weird. Then I came across a name that said, God is my uncle. I had trouble squaring that one. That did not fit with my missionary theology much. And if I'd been doing other Semitic languages like Moabite, I would have come across God is my father-in-law. My wife is wonderful, but she's not strictly divine. Neither is my father-in-law. And if we come at this thinking, well, in what sense can God be your brother or your father or your uncle or your father-in-law? And I learned later that most of the time in the Old Testament and among Israel's neighbors, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the other peoples, they used what we think of as strictly biological terms in very non-biological ways. In fact, when you made a covenant with someone, whether that was a king with his people, or a people with God, or a human with another human in a business arrangement, you would call each other by biological terminology. You were brothers. You were father and son. And there's a great article on this by one of the fantastic Hebrew Bible scholars who knew everything before the field exploded. And he says, we used to have this backwards, and now we know better. We used to think that some of this family terminology came from covenant stuff, and now we know that covenant terminology came directly from family relationships. When you enter into a covenant with someone, you start using family terms. Well, what do we find in the Book of Mormon? King Benjamin, because of the covenant which ye have made, ye shall be called the children of Christ, his sons and his daughters. For behold, this day he hath spiritually begotten you. Therefore ye are born of him and have become his sons and his daughters. Christ is the covenant father. That is one thing that would have been dead obvious to Israelites in this context. That is not at all obvious to us as moderns, because first of all, we don't know that Israelite stuff. We certainly don't sign our contract with the banker and then call the banker father, right? And second, because we are importing things into the text that postdate the text by hundreds and hundreds of years. Trinitarian Godhead controversies and arguments, right? So if we can get this other contextual historical information, a lot of these problems dissipate. Not all of them, to be clear, but many of them. So I want to go back and remind you of these two key phrases. Scripture is for us, but not to us, and it goes without being said. Now, having demonstrated this stuff and shown you some examples, where do we get this information? Again, I don't think any of you need to go learn Hebrew. You don't need to go back to grad school. A lot of this is just easily accessible. There are two church web pages that list a bunch of free sources. And these free sources are where scholars like me tend to write articles aimed at lay Latter-day Saints or Seminary and Institute teachers. These are sources like BYU Studies. I am a guest editor of a special BYU Studies episode coming next year, an entire journal volume of about 20 essays on the topic of Latter-day Saint faith and biological evolution. We have things in there on science, on scripture, on church history, and that will be free the day it hits the internet. BYU Religious Studies Center, Religious Educator is a journal that is put out for Seminary Institute teachers, free online. Scripture Central, they've grown a lot in the last couple of years. You may have seen some of their podcasts or videos. They also have subnames Book of Mormon Central, New Testament Central, the Interpreter Foundation, the Maxwell Institute, and there are others. Now outside of, and this great little book by retired BYU philosophy professor Falconer. It's called Scripture Study Tools and Suggestions. You can buy it off Amazon, but it's also freely available in PDF from the BYU webpage if you search for it. Beyond LDS sources, study Bibles are an exceptionally useful way to get into the world of the Bible. I have two of my favorites here. On the left is the NRSV Cultural Background Study Bible, which provides cultural backgrounds. It brings you into some of the parallel literature of the ancient Near East that the Israelites knew that we are not aware of, that in fact could not have been aware of up until 100 years ago. And because it wasn't discovered, it wasn't translated, they didn't understand the languages. This stuff was not available to the King James translators. It wasn't even available to Joseph Smith. But the NRSV Cultural Background Study Bible is a favorite of mine. The Jewish Study Bible is from a Jewish scholarly perspective. I have the first edition up here. It's quite excellent. It's obviously Jewish, so of course they don't see Isaiah as prophesying of Jesus. But what's really interesting about them is the NRSV Cultural Background is done by Christian scholars. And they will read things differently than the Jewish scholars do. And sometimes as a Latter-day Saint, I see myself lining up with one and sometimes lining up with the other. It's good not to have just one source. In that journal, Religious Educator, that I mentioned, Josh Sears, who has a PhD in Old Testament, wrote an article called Study Bibles, an Introduction for Latter-day Saints. Talks about these and their, what they do, how they work, which ones he recommends, which ones to stay away from. And most interesting, clickbaity headline, what Elder Holland is studying each morning in 2021 may surprise you. Well, I'll spoil it. He was reading a study Bible. And he was having a great time with it. Now, since we're getting into Book of Mormon next year, let me give you two of these. On the left is the Book of Mormon Maxwell Institute Study Edition across the top. I don't know if you can read that. That's 4 or 5 years old, and that came from the Maxwell Institute, one of those groups that the church recommends. And on the right is a brand new one, the Annotated Book of Mormon, out of Oxford Press. Now, both my wife, who is a professor at Arizona State, and my niece, who just graduated high school, have really enjoyed this. It speaks to a wide variety of educational backgrounds and depth and experience. Now, I specified that this one's from Oxford Press because there is another book called the Annotated Book of Mormon that I not only can't recommend, I strongly recommend you stay away from. It's done by non-scholars. It incorporates a lot of not just bad scholarship, but hoaxes and other things. So if you're looking for the annotated Book of Mormon, make sure it's the one from Oxford Press, 2023. And again, this is going up on YouTube, and all of this stuff is found on my blog one way or another. Now let me close by quoting from Elder Stephen L. Richards from the April 1932 General Conference, which I know you all recall. The revelations of the new dispensation, as well as those of the Bible, were in the beginning and are now interpreted by men. And men interpret in light of experience and understanding. In the interpretation of Scripture and doctrine, they are dependent on their knowledge and experience.